Hi, this is Justin Colletti from SonicScoop, coming at you today from Sterling Sound, one of the premier mastering studios, not just in New York City, but probably the world. Today, we get to do an interview with John Congleton, one of my favorite producer-engineers. He's worked with St. Vincent, Explosions in the Sky, Franz Ferdinand, Angel Olsen, the Walkmen, a whole bunch of amazing artists. He just won a Grammy for his work on St. Vincent's most recent album. We're going to talk in depth about that record and several others, as well as his approach to mixing, some of his favorite gear. John, thanks for hanging out with us.
You bet.
All right. So first things first, I guess since we're here in Sterling, I should just ask you, one of my favorite mastering engineers, Greg Calby, works here. What made you end up getting attracted to work going on at Sterling, working with Greg on the mastering side?
Right. It's funny, it's like before even I started making records, I felt like I knew Greg's name because it's something on the back of so many records that I loved, like Born to Run and things like that. So, I mean, even before I knew what a mastering engineer was, for some reason that name was sort of buried in my subconscious or whatever, you know. So I think that really the first time I ever worked with Greg was really kind of just by happenstance of like I worked on a record when they wanted to work with Greg.
Right.
And Greg was like one of those mastering engineers who like called me up on the phone and asked me about the project and asked me about like what we were going for, and I was just like, well, this is nice, you know? Like he actually seemed to have a genuine curiosity about what the record was all about, and that goes a long way for me, you know, being somebody who likes to make records with like a vast understanding of where the artist is at that moment, and he, you know, considering that mastering is such a technical, geeky kind of thing, the fact that he even cared to have that conversation just meant a lot to me. And then of course the record came back and it sounded fantastic. So I was like, well, I think I should probably work with this guy more, you know?
Yeah,
so.
I hear you. On the sonic side, what do you think a mastering engineer brings to the table? I mean, what kind of specific things are you looking for at the end of the process after you've taken as far as you can go?
You know, it's the final stroke, I suppose. I like to tell people that, like, you know, when we're mixing a record, every place you listen to the mixes on, that, you know, the mixes will sound different. Like some places they'll sound incredible, some places they'll sound terrible. Sometimes the vocals seem really quiet, sometimes the bass sounds really loud on this stereo, and that's like a way to like really drive yourself crazy.
Yeah.
If you hear the same thing over and over as a problem, that's a mix thing.
Sure.
But if you hear just inconsistencies on stereo to stereo, that's a mastering thing. And I found that all that matters is that you make it sound good where you know where it's supposed to sound like. So in your studio. So I've never been one of those engineers or producers or whatever who burns the CD and listens to it in his car and at home. It just drives me crazy, you know? Like that's just, that to me is like, that's just a recipe for madness and losing objectivity. So I just try really hard to make it sound good in a place that I know where it should sound like. And then usually if you have the right mastering engineer, you know, they kind of snap it into focus to where it sounds good everywhere.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I hear you. One of the interesting things about your work, I think, and I think Greg has this in common too, is that you seem like a bit of a chameleon. Like I listened to a Baroness record and it sounds like pitch perfect, like heavy rock stuff. You listen to your Clap Your Hands Say Yeah stuff and it sounds like this kind of really saturated, vibey indie rock thing.
Right.
Then even within St. Vincent, there are so many different places. Right. Fundamentally, do you start a different way when you're recording each? What point do you say, here's where we're going? How do you get there?
I've never like distinctly said, I'm going to be a chameleon. I think that really ultimately the way I feel about production in general is it is about uplifting the artist. So for me to sort of superimpose some sort of like John Congleton approach and sound, that's like, not only is that extremely disrespectful in my estimation, it's insanely boring. Yeah. And 3, I'm also just sort of committing myself to not having a very long career. So I don't want any of those things. Right. But mainly the main thing is I just find it boring. You know, I mean, I have a great respect for the entire lineage of recorded music, and there's something to be learned from kind of all kinds of approaches. When you hear that sort of shape-shifting sort of thing, that's more or less of me just trying to keep myself inspired and beautify the artist. But as far as like approach, like for something like St. Vincent, where every song is kind of different, that actually kind of comes from more of just the school of like the White Album, the Beatles record, where it's like every song sounds different because every song was a different setup. You know, like when you do a record, like most records, a band comes in, they set up, you put up some microphones, and essentially there are amendments to that, but essentially it's the same setup. Yeah. You know, and a part of that is brevity. Part of it is just consistency. You want a consistent sound, you know? But with something like St. Vincent, where we were literally, the record was being written as we went, we would kind of work up a couple songs, get them in a good place, and we would call the drummer in and say, okay, come in and play. And it was usually a completely different setup, a different drum kit, different place, not a different studio so much as a different place in the room even, you know? And it just sort of like, all those calls I just kind of made like on the fly. Like, we'd be talking, Severed Cross Fingers was like, I think we had talked about that being sort of like an early 70s Pink Floyd kind of groove.
Sure.
And if you listen, that's very much the kind of drum sound that's on that song. So it's just kind of shooting from the hip, you know, like maybe something like this. When you're working with an artist who really trusts you and you trust the artist, you guys just both know if it's working or not. And if it doesn't work, then you just change it. It's just that simple. You just change it. And usually it's just as simple as picking up the snare and putting a different one there. That's really all you got to do a lot of times. Or just tell them to play differently. Don't hit as hard. Hit harder. Whatever.
Yeah. So I'd imagine that on some records, like say a Baroness record, where it's a kind of really heavy straight ahead, there's some consistency. It's maybe more that conventional approach of let's set it up, let's capture basics. And then when you're doing something like St. Vincent, it's more thinking of each song or groups of songs as their own entities?
Definitely, but I would say with Baroness, that's actually an exception to that. Like the heavy records I've done, one of my favorite heavy records I've done in the last few years is this band called Tombs. And it's a kind of a favorite record of a lot of people. I know that if somebody mentions that record to me, I know that they're a real fan, you know, like, you got that record. I really like it because it's kind of a black metal record, and like that's a metal band that came in, you know, they just set up and they nailed it. You know, that was a situation where I just put some mics in front and we just, 7 days recorded, mixed, and done, out the door. And Baroness, the first record I did with them was a little bit like that, but the second record I did with them, which was Yellow and Green, that was a double record, and that was like a St. Vincent record. Every song was a completely different drum setup, different tuning. John, who's kind of the creative thrust of that band, really wanted to make a psychedelic record. There was no talk of making a heavy record. It was, let's make a psychedelic record, which I'm from Texas. I'm steeped in the 60s garage psychedelic stuff, 13th Floor Elevators, all that stuff. My dad played in a lot of those bands. That is my mother's milk, you know, like, making those kinds of records really comes very easy to me. So yeah, with that record, that was like, we were really throwing spaghetti at the wall. Like, we're like, let's just see what sticks, and like, let's come up with sounds that we've never heard before, you know? I mean, all making a record ever is a conversation. You know, you're just constantly talking about what is this thing we're making. And a lot of times as a producer, you really should just be listening. And they're going to kind of just throw all sorts of things at you. And it's kind of your job to sort of like look through that scrim of madness that they're throwing at you and find like the kernels of truth, I guess, you know. It's just sort of like, what does this song kind of remind us of? What are the things we should avoid in the way that it reminds us? You know, so we're like pushing the nexus of music forward as opposed to just a pastiche or whatever. So since you say St. Vincent, what we would do is she would come in with an idea and we would kind of make concentric circles around that idea to where we basically had the format of a song. And it would be in a demo. You know, and sometimes I would just sequence a drum part or something like that, and she'd lay down a rough vocal, rough guitar, and we would sort of just talk about what it sounded like, or what do we want this to ultimately be, and then we kind of just would come up with a game plan. But by the time a drummer would come in, we would have a pretty great idea of what we wanted, you know, as far as like the overall approach. It's a little evasive to say this, but it's really just about a conversation. It's just constantly talking about what you want it to be, and also honesty of like when something isn't really working, you gotta be honest with each other and admit when things aren't working, you know, and so you can stop it and restart, you know.
Do you think of a lot of these albums as having a pre-production phase and then a production phase, or do they kind of get intertwined?
Every record is different, man.
Sure.
Some records, the band, you know, the songs are really in a good place, and I just say, just walk in and I'll put some microphones on and we'll start, I'll be recording the pre-production,
right,
so to speak, you know. And then there are sometimes records, and this is happening more and more, it seems, where it's a lot of long distance sort of sending songs back and forth kind of thing. Every record is different.
I hear you.
Every record is different. If I have absolutely no method to making records. It's like, what are you trying to do? What's the amount of time that you want to spend doing that? Do we have time to sit in a practice space? Do we need to sit in a practice space?
Sure.
You know, a lot of times I like to just think of my studio as the practice space.
Right.
You know, like just come in and I'll put some microphones on it and we'll bang it out. Because the second rough run through might be the magic one, you know. I love Al Green. Recently I've been listening to Al Green so much, and like those recordings, those are just amazing players who don't really know the song all that well.
Right.
You know, they kind of, you get the feeling it's like kind of the third run through.
Right.
And everyone's kind of playing conservatively, but they know the song well enough to where they feel like they can step out a little bit. But they're also just scared enough to where they don't want to get in front of Al Green's way. I mean, I just love those recordings so much because it's like people who are masterful at their instruments with a sense of freedom, you know? And I feel like that's what I try is cultivate a sense of freedom and creativity in the studio to where people aren't afraid to just play.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a great artist to bring up because so much of that Al Green stuff, you can feel the fire inside of the players. And you can feel them holding back. And it's very different than, say, a Motown, right, where they're workshopping everything. It's been through iteration upon iteration. And they say, now we're going to record it for real.
And I love those recordings too. I mean, there's no one way to do this. I just lately, the last few years of my life, I've just been so taken with those Al Green recordings. You know, I'm tired of being alone. I just can't even imagine something sounding better. It's so beautiful sounding and honest and visceral and immediate. You know?
Well, this is a great segue into your ability to kind of hone in and capture sounds that feel like they're from another era. I feel like you've gotten some very, very modern hi-fi punchy sounds like Digital Witness, like Cruel. But on that stuff like The Party, Severed Cross Fingers, where they sound like they could be 70s, 60s drum tones, where do you start to get that kind of a tone? Do you start with references? Do you start with a particular mic setup? If you're going for that kind of tone, how do you start?
It all starts with the drummer.
Yeah.
It really does. You got to call the right drummer in first, and both of those songs, I remember distinctly, are the same drummer, Mackenzie Smith, who's without a doubt my first call drummer. If I'm working with somebody in Texas at my studio, he's in the area.
Sure.
And we've done a zillion things together, and I have a great shorthand with him. He can just come in and knock it out, and there's no ego. And he's like, what are we going for? And I'll say, well, something sort of like this. Severed Cross Fingers, I'm almost positive I said Dark Side of the Moon.
Sure.
You know, and if you listen, it's that swung, very placid ride cymbal, kind of like, just kind of like coasting through. So it all starts with the drummer, starts with technique, starts with having that drummer play a certain way, first, and then you put some microphones in front of it, man. I don't know. I mean, you just put some microphones in front of it. That's all sort of more of the geeky minutia that, I'm happy to get into detail.
We're going to have some geeky people watching this, so I'm going to have to press you for some particulars.
Sure, yeah.
If you were going for the kind of more modern hi-fi sound as opposed to that kind of more 60s or 70s sound, do you start with more mics, fewer mics? Do you start with certain distances?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and say that as far as detail goes, I'm going to be pretty mysterious just in the fact that I don't remember.
Yeah.
And I will say that I love microphones as a geek, and I love gear. I think it's super fun, but I always think of gear as something that just inspires me. I don't think that gear really makes the record be great. I mean, anybody who's been doing this really knows that.
Absolutely.
You should always remember gear is something to sort of inspire you, and don't let the artist or the player even notice.
Right.
First of all, I never think too much about like a era when it comes to sounds. I think, how can I make it timeless?
Yeah.
How can I make it exciting, familiar, but timeless?
Yeah.
So, I have no method, but usually I put up way more mics than I would ever use. I think it's kind of common, it's a pretty common thing for me to use, for example, like 2 microphones on the snare top because I don't know what I want just yet.
Sure.
Like I'll use a super bright one and a super dark one. Pretty remedial kind of concept, really. And because I don't know where it's all going just yet.
When do you try to make that decision? Do you try to make it in the tracking process, or do you sometimes save those decisions for later?
I definitely try to make as many decisions as possible early on. My goal always is to have the song sounding like it's mixed before I mix it. Like essentially we know what it's all about before we balance it.
If you set up 12 or 16 mics, would you not necessarily record all of them, or do you still record all of them for safety?
I only record things that sound good.
Yeah, that's a good habit to be in, man.
The worst thing about record production now is the ability to record too much.
Yeah.
That's some horrible stuff, in my opinion.
I know, man. This was going to be one of the questions I wanted to get to eventually, but I think this is a perfect segue into it. I love that idea of tracking a record to sound mixed before you get to the mixing stage.
Well, you know, I mean, that's the records that, you know, I guarantee you, those Al Green records, you pull the faders up, it sounds like the record.
Yeah.
You know, that didn't happen in the mix. That's not I don't like the idea of mixing being a black art. I don't enjoy that at all. That's, to me, completely unromantic. All the times that I've been hired to mix a record that sounded great before it came to me, man, it was all in the faders. I just, you know, you pull it up and it's like, it is what it is, you know? Yeah. And here's another interesting thing that I love about, when you know that it's really good tracking when you pull up the bass drum and it sounds terrible. And you pull up the snare drum, it's like, that is sloshy and there's so much hi-hat bleed in that, oh my God. And you pull up this and that, this is terrible. You pull it all up and it's a gorgeous thing, and it's because that engineer had made you know that he or she has made so many records that she knows that pushing the solo button is useless.
Yep.
It's useless. That's just to see if there's distortion on the channel. Just never even touch it, because it's all about what it sounds like together.
How long were you doing this before you finally ingrained that habit? Did you get into that habit early, or did it take a while to remember not to press solo?
All the engineers that I grew up around, they were solo freaks. Yeah. They were solo freaks. The band would be out there tracking, and they would be soloing the whole time. Like, what's that doing for the song? Who cares? Who cares what the hi-hat sounds like by itself? Right. What does it sound like with everything else? I think probably pretty early on. All the great tracks that I've ever been handed to mix, the tracks sound ridiculous by themselves. Right. And I love that. One of the best living engineers in the world, Steve Albini, his tracks sound ridiculous when you solo them. Right. They sound ridiculous, but they sound, you know, when you pop it all into focus, the phasing is immaculate. Because he's listening to the whole thing, you know. He's not sitting there like detailing things, because nobody cares. Nobody cares what something sounds like by itself when it's not going to be in the whole picture.
All right, well, thanks again to John Congleton for taking the time. Thanks to Sterling Sound for having us. And thanks to B&H for being involved. If you want to see more great interviews like this one, go to SonicScoop.com, go to B&H.com, sign up for the newsletter there, and you'll get info whenever we come out with a new video in this series. Thanks for hanging out with us. See you next time.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.